For 2 decades, Ansel carried the quiet shame of his grandfather, Elias, the man who abandoned his family for a silent monastery in the Colorado Rockies, only to vanish into the wilderness. The official report called it a spiritual walkabout, a peaceful end for a man who had renounced the world. But when a routine geological survey airdrops a photo of a strange crevice, Ansel spots something impossibly familiar: the glint of Elias's skull-bead mala, wedged deep in the rock next to a shattered smartphone. That single image did more to unravel 20 years of history than Ansel ever thought possible. If you've ever had a moment that changed how you saw your entire past, you'll understand the journey he was about to take. Let us know in the comments what clue you think would be the most shocking to find from a long-lost relative. Ansel traced the edges of the high-resolution photograph on his computer screen. The image was clinically sharp, meant for geological analysis, but for Ansel, it was a ghost. He was an architect, a man who dealt in blueprints, stress tolerances, and the unyielding logic of physics. His life was a grid of straight lines and right angles, a quiet rebellion against the messy, unexplained chaos his grandfather had left behind. Elias's disappearance wasn't a sad mystery in their family. It was a wound, an act of supreme selfishness that had shattered his daughter, Ansel's mother, and left a legacy of unanswered questions. To Ansel, the story of a spiritual walkabout was just a pretty narrative to cover the ugly truth of abandonment. The email had been a surprise. It came from an old college friend, now a cartographer with the SHES. They were mapping fault lines in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and he'd attached a folder of aerial shots for a potential government contract Ansel was bidding on. Check out the detail shot in folder 7, the email read. Weird what you find out here. Almost looks like someone dropped their rosary. Ansel had clicked, expecting nothing. And then he saw it. Not a rosary, but a mala, a string of 108 wooden prayer beads. And leading the strand was one bead, carved from bone into the shape of a human skull. He knew it instantly. It was the same mala from the one photo his mother kept of Elias from his monastery days. But it was the object next to it that made no sense. A phone. Elias had renounced the world, including its technology. He wouldn't have owned a phone. A feeling Ansel hadn't experienced in years began to stir in his chest. Curiosity. This wasn't a peaceful man wandering off to meet his end. This was a contradiction. This was a puzzle. He called his mother that evening. I have to go up there, he said, his voice more resolute than he expected. It's for a potential job, scouting a site near Westcliff. It was a half-truth, but it was kinder than the real one, that he was going to chase the ghost of a man he had spent his entire adult life resenting. His mother's silence on the other end of the line was heavy with 20 years of pain. Be careful, Ansel, she finally whispered. There's nothing left for us in those mountains. He knew she was wrong. For the first time, there might be. The drive from Denver into the mountains was a slow ascent from his orderly world into the untamed wilderness that had claimed his grandfather. The small town of Westcliff was nestled in a valley, looking up at the jagged peaks that had been Elias's final home. The local sheriff's office was a small, practical building that smelled of old coffee and paperwork. Sheriff Brody was a man whose tired eyes had seen enough small-town drama to last a lifetime. He listened to Ansel's story with a patient, weary expression, pulling up the old file on Elias Freeman. It was thin. A few witness statements from the monks, a summary of the fruitless search, and the final conclusion: no foul play suspected. A spiritual walkabout, son, Brody said, closing the folder. Happens out here more than you'd think. People come looking for answers and just keep walking. He was dismissive, not unkindly, but clearly saw Ansel as another grieving relative chasing shadows. You find a phone, you say. Well, that is a bit strange for a man like him. But after 20 years, it's not evidence. It's just litter. He gave Ansel the USGS coordinates, but warned him the area was treacherous and off-trail. You'll need a guide, he advised. Go see Silas at the outfitter shop. He knows these mountains better than anyone. Silas was exactly as Ansel had pictured: weathered face, a beard the color of salt and pepper, and hands that looked like they were carved from old wood. He remembered the case. The wandering monk, Silas said with a nod, leaning against a counter of fishing lures. Big story back then. Most folks figured he found what he was looking for. A quiet place to pass on. Silas looked at the printed photo, his brow furrowing at the phone. Well now, that part of the story is new. He agreed to take Ansel up the next morning. The hike was grueling. They left the marked trails behind, scrambling over loose rock and through dense thickets of pine. Silas moved with an easy, practiced grace, while Ansel, a city dweeman despite his fitness, felt clumsy and out of place. As they climbed higher, the air grew thin and cold. Finally, Silas pointed to a sheer rock face above them. The coordinates put it up there, in that fissure. It was a climb, not a hike. After securing ropes, Silas led the way. Ansel's heart pounded in his chest, a mix of adrenaline and a strange, unfamiliar anticipation. The crevice was narrow and deep, and there, just as in the photograph, lay the two objects. The prayer beads were draped over a jutting piece of granite, the skull bead's empty eyes seeming to stare up at him. The phone was shattered, its screen a spiderweb of cracks. Ansel reached in, his fingers closing around the smooth, worn beads. He felt an unexpected jolt, a connection to the grandfather he'd never known. He carefully pocketed the mala and then the broken phone. It wasn't a modern smartphone, he now realized. It was an old, cheap burner phone, the kind used for anonymity. The mystery deepened. Back in town, Ansel felt a growing obsession. He thanked Silas, who simply nodded and said, "Hope you find what you're looking for, son." Ansel knew he couldn't go to the sheriff. He needed someone else. He found the town's only electronics repair shop in a small storefront tucked between a laundromat and a bakery. The sign read, Mountain Tech Repair. Inside, a young woman with bright purple hair and a series of complex piercings looked up from a dismantled laptop. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her name was Lena. Ansel laid the broken phone on the counter. "I know this is a long shot," he said. "It's been sitting in a rock crevice for what I think is 20 years. Is there any way to get anything off of it?" Lena picked it up, her eyes lighting up with genuine interest. 20 years? Whoa. The battery's toast, the screen's useless, but the SIM card might be a different story. She worked for over an hour, her movements precise and focused. Finally, she looked up. "The phone itself is a brick, but I was able to pull the SIM. It's damaged, but let me see what my software can pull." Ansel waited, pacing the small shop. This was it. The first real clue. Lena's face was a mask of concentration as she stared at her monitor. "Okay," she said after a long silence. "Not much here. The data is heavily corrupted. I've got some garbled text fragments, looks like parts of a message, and one outgoing call log. The number's been disconnected for years." Ansel's shoulders slumped. It was a dead end. "Wait a second," Lena said, leaning closer to the screen. "There's a hidden audio file. It's deleted, but a fragment is still in the cache. Let me see if I can restore it." The sound that crackled from her speakers was faint, distorted by static, but unmistakable. It was a recording of two men talking. The first voice was younger, confident. "Call yourself Brother Eris, right? But that's not your real name. My source says you were with the agency, Section 7, the Perseus Project." Then another voice, older, gravelly, with a weariness that seemed to echo through the years. It was a voice Ansel had never heard, but he knew, with absolute certainty, that it was his grandfather. "You're a very foolish young man," Elias's voice said. "You need to leave." The recording cut out. Ansel stood frozen, the words hanging in the air. Agency, Section 7, Perseus Project. None of it made sense. His grandfather was a librarian before he joined the monastery, a quiet, bookish man. He took the disconnected phone number from Lena and spent the rest of the night in his motel room, cross-referencing it with online databases of old missing persons cases. At 3 a.m, he got a hit. The phone number had belonged to a man named Corbin Vance, an investigative journalist. He'd been reported missing 20 years ago, the very same week his grandfather had vanished. His last known location, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The phone didn't belong to Elias. It belonged to the man who found him. Ansel felt the ground shift beneath him. His grandfather wasn't a simple monk who had wandered off. He was Brother Eris, a man with a past so dangerous a journalist had died trying to uncover it. He was in hiding. Ansel took the prayer beads from his bag, running his thumb over the carved skull. It felt heavier than the other beads, denser. He examined it under the cheap motel lamp, noticing a faint, almost invisible seam running around its circumference. With trembling fingers, he twisted it. There was a soft click, and the tiny skull came apart in his hands. Tucked inside the hollow space was not a prayer or a relic. It was a minuscule, tightly wound spool of microfilm. The beads weren't just a clue left behind in a struggle. They were the key. His grandfather hadn't just disappeared. He had left a message. Ansel's journey started with retrieving a simple keepsake, but it ended with uncovering a secret that was far bigger and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. What do you think is the most compelling reason someone would leave their entire life behind to live in total isolation? We spend a lot of time searching for stories that make you think, and if this one did, perhaps you'll consider subscribing to join our community of curious minds. We appreciate every single one of you who tunes in.